In this video, we will be discussing several vocabulary words associated with the division of segments and angles. A point, segment, line, or ray that divides segments into two congruent segments bisects the segment. So if we look at our given and diagram, we have that segment AB is congruent to segment BC. Therefore, the conclusion we can make is that point B bisects segment AC. Now, similarly, a point that divides a segment into two congruent segments is the midpoint of the segment. So if we look at the diagram and given, it's almost the exact same thing. We have that segment PQ is congruent to segment QR, except the conclusion that we can make is that point Q is the midpoint of segment PR. Now be careful, even though these two vocabulary words are very similar, we are not going to use them interchangeably. Depending on what we are trying to prove, that's how we will determine which one to use. Next, a ray that divides an angle into two congruent angles bisects the angle. So we may also bisect angles. And if angle RQS is congruent to angle SQT, the conclusion we can make is that ray QS bisects the entire angle. So that would be angle RQT. So just like we can bisect segments, we can also bisect angles. Now similarly, a ray that divides an angle into two congruent angles is called the angle bisector. Diagram again very similar. Angle GFH is congruent to angle HFI. So the conclusion that we can make is that ray FH is an angle bisector. Again, even though these two things are very similar, depending on what you are trying to prove, that's how you are going to determine which vocabulary word to use or which conclusion you can use. Now moving on, we can also trisect segments and angles. So 2 points, segments, rays or lines that divide a segment into 3 congruent segments trisect the segment. So if we look at our given, we have 3 congruent segments, AB, BC, and CD. So the conclusion that we can make are that points B and C trisect segment AD. So trisect means divide into 3, bisect means divide into 2. Similarly, 2 points that divide a segment into 3 congruent segments are known as the trisection points of that segment. So if we look at our given, we have that segments LP, PH, and HS are congruent. So the conclusion that we can make is that point P and point H are trisection points. So again, even though they are very similar, depending on what you're trying to prove, that's how you determine which reason or which vocabulary word to use. Similarly, 2 rays that divide an angle into 3 congruent angles trisect the angle. So if angle KJL is congruent to angle LJM, which is also congruent to angle MJN, then the conclusion we can make is that ray JL and ray JM trisect the entire angle, which is angle KJN. Notice the only things that can bisect or trisect angles are rays. Those are the only things. Whereas for segments, you can have a point, line, ray, segment. And finally, 2 rays that divide an angle into 3 congruent angles are known as angle trisectors. So same exact diagram, 3 congruent angles. The conclusion we can make if we have those 3 congruent angles is that ray DB and ray DC are angle trisectors because they are dividing angle ADE into 3 congruent angles. So now hopefully you have a better understanding of the difference between bisect and trisect. We're going to be using this over and over throughout the school year in honors geometry. These are very important vocabulary words to know.